Welcome to another episode of the Voice of WFP podcast. Today, we delve into the fascinating and multifaceted world of small island developing states. These islands are dotted across the globe, and they face unique challenges and opportunities due to their small nature. To shed light on the topic, we have a quick chat with our very first country director and representative of WFP Caribbean, Mr. Regis Chapman. Regis, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
Good, thanks.
From where you sit, what is peculiar about SIDS in the Caribbean and across the globe?
So I think what's important for WFP to recognize when we look at how we engage in SIDS is the uniqueness or that peculiarity that they have. And I think there's a couple of aspects that are really important to take into account. One is the smallness and the geographical isolation of them, right? The smallness of the actual landmass creates significant vulnerabilities. It creates economic vulnerabilities, it creates climatic vulnerabilities, and many others. And that geographic isolation from larger scale markets and resources that move quite easily between non-SIDS around the globe to get to SIDS are much more costly. So really that smallness is a starting point. And we see the way that smallness impacts or is reflected in the impacts of climate shocks. Mm-hmm. So when a hurricane hits a small island developing states, it is absolutely devastating and at a national scale. So Dominica is a great example. In 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Dominica and it tore the roofs off or destroyed or damaged houses of 85% of the population. I mean, if you're in any other country that's not a SIDS, having that percentage of a population damage, it's just unfathomable. At the same time, Dominica lost over 220% of its GDP in a single day. One storm passing through wipes out the GDP, 220% of GDP of a country. So huge, massive economic setbacks as a result. Similarly, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there was a volcanic eruption in 2021. And what we saw is that 20% of the population had to be relocated as that volcano started to get more and more active in preparation for an eventual explosion, which of course occurred. And so, again, 20% of your population moving out of 1/3 of the country into the other 2/3. These are just percentages and proportions that are unfathomable in other contexts. I think the other part, and very much linked to the smallness, because everything's small. It's the geographic mass, it's the populations. But there's one thing that's not small, and it's indebtedness. So countries throughout the Caribbean are some of the most indebted countries in the world. We talk about the challenges of middle-income countries and this development trap that they fall into when they graduate, quote unquote, from a lot of assistance that they might receive from traditional donors. I think the difference between a normal middle-income country and a SIDS that's a middle-income country is this indebtedness, right? So that stall that they have in their development progress it's not really a stall in the Caribbean. It becomes sort of a permanent state.
Wow. You really presented some alarming figures there pertaining to the GDP and the climate crisis and all crippled by debt, the debt crisis as well. Mm-hmm. So given that the climate crisis, the debt crisis, how do you see WFP supporting small island developing states?
Yeah. So every country is different. Right. And so I don't think it's necessarily fair to say this is what WFP should do in SIDS. Mm-hmm. I think there are common aspects of the vulnerabilities, so the smallness and these other issues of indebtedness that I mentioned. And that's an important starting point for WFP to understand. When we opened the office here for the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean, it's a different landscape, and WFP had not been present for many years. And so, what we've tried to do is look at what are the common issues and then how do we tailor our support to each country. Mm-hmm. And when we opened the office, we sort of saw two very specific areas where WFP's expertise could support governments to achieve their development agendas. And I think this is an important point. It's not WFP coming in with a parallel program or a parallel system. From day one, we really took a systems-based approach. How can we help government systems better serve their populations, because we knew in this context that WFP's traditional types of operations, would not stand to be funded in the way that it would in other countries. And obviously there's a lot of competition for traditional donor resources. So by taking this viewpoint of looking at governments and their systems, I think that set us off on a very unique track. And so the two areas that we began with focus on was social protection and disaster management, but also looking at the linkages between the two. And what we saw with COVID-19 is some of that initial groundwork we were doing around evidence generation and knowledge sharing really led to a more operational support. So every country in the Caribbean, probably every country in the world to a degree, use their social protection systems to meet growing needs. And so that transition from evidence generation and information sharing to sort of more concrete operational advisory, and at times helping to fill operational gaps, that shift was quite natural. And at the same time, what we saw is that food security in the Caribbean, and I often say this, when I first arrived here, we didn't talk about food security because it wasn't a priority for the governments. Now, there were issues around poverty and vulnerability that lead to food insecurity. And as a WFP professional, I'm able to make that case and articulate that, but it wasn't what the governments wanted to hear, so we didn't talk about that. But when COVID-19 hit, that changed. And so WFP began to work with the Caribbean Community Secretariat, or CARICOM Secretariat, and we've rolled out 6 rounds of COVID-19 food security and livelihood surveys. Started off COVID-19, now it's just sort of a rolling food security and livelihood survey. And what we saw from the onset of the pandemic, in the sort of middle income and upper middle income status that we have throughout the region, general population was able to get by in those first months of the pandemic. But what we saw from the second round onward is really that divide between the haves and the have-nots. And that has deepened already existing inequalities. And it became even worse after the war in Ukraine, where we saw global food price increases, supply chain cost increases, and a number of other issues, right? And so that helped governments to bring data to this discussion, and it really elevated food security as an issue in the Caribbean. And so more and more we're also now involved in helping to strengthen food systems, but again, looking at it through government systems, not a WFP intervention in a community per se. So really, we see these government programs in social protection, disaster management, and in food systems as opportunities for WFP to provide technical assistance for governments to better do their job at supporting their populations.
2024 is a very important year, and the governments and the leaders of small and developed states across the globe will converge in Antigua and Barbuda in May 2024 to identify the challenges and opportunities and to really map out the blueprint, the sustainable development blueprint for the next 10 years. What are your expectations coming out of the 2024 conference?
And SIDS have, I think people often say, been punching above their weight, right? And I think this is, it's quite, it links to that aspect on one hand being a SIDS, a small island state, versus being this big ocean country, right? And it's that bigness that I think the punching above the weight sort of comes in. And I think SIDS have really been at the forefront of pushing some of the traditional development architecture and saying, this has to change. You can no longer look at us just based on our GDP. Access to climate financing is another one. Some of the most impacted by climate change countries, including those here in the Caribbean, are some that are accessing the least amount of climate financing. And that just simply has to change. The amount of climate financing per capita should very much be linked with the vulnerability and the impacts that climate change is having in these countries. And so we need to find ways to make accessing that finance easier. And this is another important point. That smallness of these countries applies to the smallness of governments. And so you can't expect that a country of 250,000 people and a government corresponding to that size of a population can have the same levels and expertise and capacities within government that a country of 100 or 150 or 200 million people have. It's just, you can't compare the two. But yet our international financial institutions and the climate finance tools are being, applied across the board, irrespective of the size of your country. Mm-hmm. And I think there needs to be a degree of accommodation of small island developing states and the smallness of those governments. The rigorousness of procurement rules or HR processes or other things that these international organizations sometimes put on these governments, again, achievable for the 100 or 200 million population country, less so for the 200,000 population country. And so I think we need to see some of these dynamics change. The Prime Minister of Barbados has been talking about what's called the Bridgetown Initiative. Yeah. And this is really about making more resources available to countries who need it most to adapt to climate change. And I think we need to look at, as an international community, how we back these types of initiatives. Again, really making sure that resources are available for countries to combat the impacts of climate change, and available at appropriate rates, right? And you can't further push countries into greater levels of debt as the approach to deal with this.
I'm glad that you touched on climate finance and the Bridgetown Initiative, and we know that the Bridgetown Initiative has gained significant traction over the years. I'm curious though, Regis, are there any programs or activities that are in the pipeline, or what you currently do to support the Bridgetown Initiative and the access to climate finance for these small and developing states?
So there's a couple of things that we're doing. And again, I think what we're trying to do is apply this in a uniquely WFP way, right? So really looking at our operational capacities. Mm-hmm. So we've been, for the last 3 years now, doing some quite innovative work around disaster risk financing. So here in the Caribbean, there's what's called the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. And so it's a macro level sovereign state insurance mechanism that allows countries to insure against earthquakes, tropical cyclones, and excessive rainfall. And so we've been working with a number of countries to augment the level of coverage that they have, or improve the aspects of their existing policies to better trigger payouts. And linked to that augmentation of coverage, we're ensuring that a portion of any payout to a government will actually go through government systems, through social protection systems, to assist through cash transfers households that have been impacted, vulnerable households that have been impacted. What's unique about this is a number of things. One, it's getting governments to really think about the human impacts that these events happen. We talked about the indebtedness, right? Yeah. When you get hit by one of these big events, there are so many competing priorities. And so what we're trying to do is say, right, you need your resources to fix infrastructure, but we need to do more for the people who are impacted. It allows for a degree of predictability of finance when an event happens. And it's positioning WFP to work with ministries of finance and ministries of social protection and disaster management authorities to put in place all the mechanisms that are needed to do that. I think that's really, one very specific, concrete thing that WFP has been doing. The other thing that we're working on is anticipatory action, which I mentioned before. And so, there's been a lot of discussions around this over the years in the Caribbean. And I think one of the things that we saw is that those discussions were ending at the discussion stage. And so what we've tried to do is really push this forward. And through our partnership with Global Affairs Canada, with USAID and others, what we've actually done is created a small fund so that we can pilot this and see what works, what doesn't work. But our aim is really to create this as a bigger mechanism beyond WFP, right? Where governments are able to access some sort of financial tool that allows them to support these populations with these actions. And I think the The third area is right now we're working with 5 countries within the region on developing a proposal for the Green Climate Fund and really looking at this intersection of food systems, social protection systems, and some of the financing mechanisms around that in support of governments.
Really, Regis, you've given us a lot of food for thought. We can sit here for hours and hours and discuss the issues, but I do appreciate you taking the time to really shed some light on the issues small island developing states face. Especially you have first-hand experience being the first country director and representative here in WFP Caribbean. Thank you so much, Regis.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.